All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Thanksgiving weekend's Saturday class series. I'm Susan Kokinda, and the main presentation, of course, is a continuation by Bob Ingram on his really groundbreaking series on George Washington. Before I turn it over to Bob, I want to highlight a particular quality which I think it's important to reflect on, especially in this particular week. And that is the quality of absolutely uncompromising, courageous leadership, which inspires people with a vision and a mission for the future. That is a uniquely human quality in the sense of being able to comprehend and act toward the future. And that has very much characterized the driving spirit which created this nation and which is still absolutely indispensable for the protection and furtherance and continuation of the American Republic. Of course, the person of George Washington, who's been the subject of these discussions, very much embodies those qualities of courage, scientific competence, such that he could shape with his allies a vision for the future. But before I turn it over to Bob, I wanted to take people to our website because there are several posts on our website that were posted this week, which I think very importantly highlight the qualities that I'm talking about. So I'm going to share the screen here. The first was our Thanksgiving post, which happened to have been authored by Bob Ingram, entitled "On Thanksgiving, the Birth of Freedom, the Pilgrims, and Our Founding." And I do want to just read the opening quote because I think it sets the theme for everything which follows and which we're continuing to discuss today. This begins with, "Reason is that wherein man goes before all other earthly creatures and comes after God only. For whereas God and nature hath furnished other creatures, some with hooves, others with other instruments and weapons both defensive and offensive, man is left naked and destitute of all these, but may comfort himself in that one endowment of reason and providence, whereby he is able to govern them all." So I encourage people to check out that particular post, which we posted several days ago on the occasion of Thanksgiving. But I do want to point out two other posts on the website, which again address this quality of the future and the kind of courageous leadership which is necessitated to stand up to the oligarchy, whether it was the oligarchy of 200 and some years ago, the oligarchy of, or the oligarchy which we're fighting today. The first I want to point out is a new post which begins to fill out our project Prometheus, building hundreds of nuclear power plants to make America great again, written by Brian Lance. And this begins to give a much more living image of the kind of robust, economically proud, technologically optimistic future, which has to inspire our political fight as we go into 2024. And then another post, which again takes up the question of the qualities of courageous leadership, which are necessary because, of course, earlier this week, November 22nd, was the 59th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy. We remind people of what it was that so terrified the global elite in the person of John Kennedy and what continues to terrify them in the potential of a Trump-led movement reclaiming, in a sense, the future for our nation as we fight going into 2024. So those questions of that quality of leadership are absolutely critical in terms of how we're going to proceed in this fight. And again, also the ferociousness with which the enemy seeks to snuff out that leadership, as they did with John Kennedy, as they're trying with Donald Trump, and as they tried with George Washington. And that will be the story that we hear tonight from Bob. So I'm going to spotlight him and he can take over.
Okay, hi everyone. So this is the 9th class overall in this Washington series, and we will conclude it next week. This is entitled, well, I don't know the long title, but essentially the title is Insurrection. And it is the story of how Thomas Jefferson and his friends launched a campaign to destroy the American Republic, even as it was just being born, before it was even fully operational. Now, a couple of things I will say that in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've covered some of what you might call heavy ideas. Hamilton's national banking and public credit policy. Last week, the question of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. But this class tonight, this particular class, is going to be more in the form of a battle report, sort of like the earlier classes, a couple of months ago, on Washington's as a general, the battles of the Revolutionary War. And I'm going to go through it year by year, beginning in 1789 and ending in 1796. So it's going to be pretty much chronological. Now, as some of you may have recalled, if you were on the class last Saturday, I mentioned as sort of an anecdote in that class that in his parlor at Monticello, Jefferson hung portraits of what he called the 3 greatest men that have ever lived. And that's a direct quote from Jefferson, the 3 greatest men that have ever lived. John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Francis Bacon, leading British representatives of the Enlightenment. I mean, one of the arguments that I will make to you tonight is that you have, number one, Jefferson's idolization of Locke, Bacon, and Newton. Secondly, his personal role in the French Revolution. And third, the attacks that he launched against Washington and Hamilton. And these are really not 3 separate things at all. They are of one piece, one, ideology or whatever you want to call it, one intention, from beginning to end. That is, hopefully that will become clear by the end of the class. For those who are not aware of it, Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France from 1785 to 1789 for 4 years in Paris, during which time, particularly in 87 and 88, he was writing letters. This is, immediately prior to the French Revolution, 87 and 88. But during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, And then during the ratification debates in 1788, Jefferson was writing letters back to Madison and to others as well, not just Madison, in which he had, had a chance to review um, the Constitution itself. He had learned firsthand of some of the debates at the Constitutional Convention. And in these letters he's writing back to America, Jefferson expresses, great disagreement with various aspects of the Constitution, and the and he and it goes beyond merely reservations, serious objections he has to various aspects of the Constitution. The one which he mentions more than once is his strong opposition to the office of the presidency as it was established in the Constitution, to a strong executive power, in the government. So, the reality is that Jefferson was not really a supporter of the Constitution. He took no part in it because he was in France. But from what he wrote about it, it is very clear that this is not the Constitution he would have preferred were he in America. And it's just as an anecdote. I think this is one of the reasons. When the Constitution came up for a debate in Virginia during the ratification process, one of the people who opposed it, strongly opposed ratification, was James Monroe. And I don't have evidence of it, but I would suspect that this might have been because of Jefferson's reservations, because Monroe was personally he was a protege of Jefferson's. Jefferson and Madison had a different kind of relationship. But Jefferson and Monroe, it's like Washington and Hamilton. Monroe was a young guy, much younger than Jefferson, and he was loyal to Jefferson like a lapdog. And he fiercely opposed the Constitution when it came up for ratification. But anyway, look, Jefferson was in Paris in 1787, 1788, most of 1789. And he was not simply a supporter of the French Revolution. He helped organize the French Revolution. And in fact, he played a very significant role in 1789. And prior to 1789, his social circle is all of these French Enlightenment people. He is meeting with and advising Lafayette and others on a regular basis. And then on July 14th, 1789, you have the storming of the Bastille, which everyone knows about. 2 weeks after that, 2 weeks after the storming of the Bastille, there was a secret meeting that was held at Lafayette's home. He was living in a hotel, the Hotel de, I don't know, Languy. I can't pronounce it, but he was living in a very fancy hotel, and he convened a secret meeting there 2 weeks after the Bastille, and the meeting included Lafayette, it included Diderot, it included Sayé, who I talked about last week, and basically what they discussed was what comes next. What do we do next? And it's coming out of that meeting that Jefferson and Lafayette write the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which Sayé then rewrites. But Jefferson is in the center of all of this, and the ideas you see coming out in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and in other things that they're doing, come at least partly from Jefferson. in August 26th, there is the convening of the Constituency Assembly in Paris. And their first act is to approve the Declaration of Rights of Man, sort of as their version of the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson is in attendance at that meeting of the National Assembly. Now, all of this is occurring within the first few months of the Washington administration. Washington had been inaugurated on April 30th. So all of this stuff, the meetings that Jefferson is having in Paris and all of that, this is going on, while the Washington administration is just coming together. Now, I want to make one thing clear at the very start here, which is you have to understand, you read history books and they talk about the fight between Washington and Jefferson, or, what's going on in France, what Washington is doing. And they talk about these things, as if they're debating something up in the air, some, academic, ideas, or, events which had, no historical connection to one another. But you have to get a sense of what is occurring here. The United States Constitution was ratified on September 13th, 1788. September 13th, 1788. Washington is sworn in on April 30th. At the time of 1789. At the time that Washington is sworn in, the Constitution had only been in existence for 7 months. 7 months. The Republic, if you want to give a birthday to the Republic was less than 7 months old. And the fact is that, up until between, the ratification of the Constitution and Washington being sworn in as president, the Constitution and the Republic itself only existed on paper. They were not a physical reality. They were not operational. The Republic had not even really come into existence yet, except on paper. So when Washington is sworn in, he is starting from scratch. You could say, really, in terms of practice, that Washington's inauguration is day one of the life of the new republic. And they have to create this republic and create the functioning of the republic from scratch. And also bear in mind what I went through several classes ago, that they're coming into this situation with a dire, absolutely existential economic and financial crisis. The nation is bankrupt. The credit of the nation is bankrupt. There's no national currency. There's nothing. The country is on the verge of economic dissolution and collapse. So this is what they're confronted with when Washington comes in. Now, Jefferson arrives back in the United States in November of 1789, arrives back from France. He stays in Virginia for, I think, 6 or 7 months. He sails to Norfolk, not to Philadelphia or New York. He sails into Norfolk. He stays at Monticello for 6 or 7 months. He has already been appointed Secretary of State by Washington, but it takes him more than half a year to get up to the Capitol. And already, while he is in Virginia, he is writing letters expressing grave misgivings about what he sees in the the tendencies, the initial policy initiatives of the Washington administration. He writes a letter during this period to Madison, and he says to Madison that he is, and this is a direct quote in the letter, Being fresh from the French Revolution in its first and pure stage, and consequently somewhat wetted up in my own Republican principles, I found a state of things in the general society on returning to America, which I could not have supposed possible. The revolution I had left in Paris, and that we had just gone through in the recent change of our own government, that is, in the adoption of the Constitution, being the common topics of conversation, I was astonished to find the general prevalence of monarchical sentiments. So that's, Jefferson's outlook upon his return to America. Now, in early 1790, Hamilton presents his initial plan to fund the public debt, through tariffs and excise taxes, to fund the public debt, to make the government solvent. That's in January and February of 1790. And at that point, Jefferson, who's in Virginia, begins a regular correspondence with Madison with the aim of defeating these proposals. And Jefferson is conspiring directly with Madison to defeat Hamilton's funding proposals, which, if they had succeeded in defeating them, the Washington administration could not have proceeded really any further, because the entire federal government would have been insolvent. Now, I would also, just to remind people from last week's class, the role of Jacques Necker in manipulating events leading up to the storming of the Bastille in France, where he deliberately, bankrupted the monarchy and the French state, such as to produce a devastating economic crisis throughout the country, particularly in Paris, which just put people into enormous desperation and led to the violent activity that broke out in the summer of 1789. And what Jefferson is conspiring with Madison about, to destroy Hamilton's economic proposals and to fund the federal debt, would have had the same effect in the United States as what Necker had done in France. Jefferson finally arrives in New York in March of 1791, or March of 1790. March of 1790, he arrives in New York, and they escalate their efforts. Now, one of the other planks, you have the funding of the debt. That was the first thing Hamilton operated on, to secure the debt of the nation and to make the nation creditworthy. That was the first step. His second step, which he unveiled in March, was the assumption of all of the various national debts and state debts, that this would all be consolidated under the federal government and then be funded by the federal government. So you would have, a stable system. So Hamilton announces this plan to assume the state debts in March. Jefferson arrives in Philadelphia, in New York City, which was then the temporary capital. He arrives there March 29th, and they immediately launch an all-out attack on this proposal to fund the state debts. Shortly after Jefferson's arrival, Hamilton's plan comes up for a vote in the House of Representatives, and it passed by a vote of 31 to 26, which is pretty close, with Madison. I mean, Jefferson's obviously not in Congress, he's the Secretary of State, but Madison and the entire Virginia delegation led the fight in the Congress to defeat this proposal for assuming the state debts. Madison took the lead on that. So here you have, in the very first months of the Washington administration, an all-out assault by Jefferson and Madison to destroy the economic initiatives that Hamilton, with Washington's backing, is making to rescue the country from bankruptcy and insolvency. And then through the spring and summer, Jefferson and Madison keep escalating their attacks all across the country. Now, in October of 1790, Jefferson helps a man named Benjamin Bach to found a newspaper in Philadelphia called the Aurora. And this then becomes the mouthpiece for Jefferson, Madison, and their allies. The Aurora becomes the key vehicle, published in Philadelphia, the key vehicle for attacking Hamilton and the Washington administration. That's in October of 1790. Then in December of 1790, Hamilton releases his report on a national bank. That's December of 1790. Jefferson goes bonkers, and he and Madison launch an all-out attack on the national bank proposal. Jefferson writes an opinion to Washington denouncing it as unconstitutional. Madison launches an all-out attack in Congress to defeat it, but it is passed in the Congress on February 2nd of 1791 by a vote of 37 to 20. At that point, in the spring of 1791, Madison and Jefferson take an extended trip to New York City and to New England, basically to recruit key individuals into an anti-Hamilton conspiracy, an anti-Hamilton, anti-Washington bloc. The initial aim is to stop all of Hamilton's economic initiatives and to drive Hamilton out of the government. They think that if they can drive Hamilton out of the government, that they'll be able to surround and control Washington. And they meet with people in a number of states, excuse me, on this trip. The most important meeting is the one they have in New York City, where they hold a meeting of Jefferson, Madison, Robert Livingston, and Aaron Burr. And they adopt at that meeting a motto, and this is literally true. They adopted that meeting a motto, Delenda est Carthago. I'm probably mispronouncing the Latin, but it means in English, Carthage must be destroyed. And Carthage is Hamilton. Hamilton must be destroyed. Things are moving forward in France. Mirabeau is elected president of the French Assembly on September 14th, 1791. Louis XVI formally accepts the new constitution. So things are progressing in France. Then in October of 1791, Jefferson founds a second newspaper, and this one is directly financed by him. He founds a second newspaper, also in Philadelphia, the National Gazette, the owner and publisher is a man named Philip Freneau. And Freneau is, if anything, more rabid, absolutely rabid than Bach. And these two newspapers then become the attack dogs, the Aurora and the National Gazette. Madison writes numerous articles anonymously for the National Gazette. And immediately the National Gazette initiates the campaign, labeling all of those who are associated with Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, all of those who are, supporting the economic agenda of the Washington administration. All of these people get labeled as monarchists, as lackeys of the British crown, and as traitors to the American Revolution. And this is done in the most violent language imaginable. And this begins with the founding of Freneau's National Gazette in October in 1791. And as we proceed, this escalates dramatically. Then in December of 1791, about a year after the report on the National Bank, Hamilton releases his report on manufacturers. But before I get to that, I want to mention one other thing first, which is that Hamilton's report on manufacturers is December of 1791. In January of 1792, remember, Washington names Gouverneur Morris as the ambassador to France, what they called the minister plenipotentiary, but basically he was the new ambassador to France. And, this sends the National Gazette, the Aurora, into paroxysms of hyperbole, of denunciations. Jefferson and Madison fight intensely to block the nomination. Jefferson writes a letter to Madison in which he says, quote, "The fact is that Gouverneur Morris is a high-flying monarchy man, shutting his eyes and his faith to every fact against his wishes. He has kept the president's mind constantly poisoned with his forebodings." Because Morris was already in Paris. He had been there for a couple of years for a variety of reasons. But he had been sending letters back on a regular basis to Washington, reporting to Washington on the horrors of what was going on in France and in Paris. And so they were determined to block Morris's confirmation. And in the Senate, it only passed by a vote of 16-13, with Jefferson doing everything in his power to try to block it in the Senate. At this time, Jefferson also wrote a letter to Lafayette. And I'll read you a little section from that letter. Jefferson says to Lafayette, quote, "A sect has shown itself among us who declare that they are that they espouse our Constitution not as a good and sufficient thing in itself, but only as a step to an English Constitution, the only thing good and sufficient in their eyes. You will wonder to be told that it is from the eastward chiefly that these champions for a king and lords come. They get some important associates from New York who have been hatched in a bed of corruption, made up after the model of their beloved England." So, those supporting the Constitution are supporting the monarchy, who want to overthrow the Constitution, that, key individuals come from New York. Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, Rufus King, John Jay, and others. These are the people who Jefferson is telling Lafayette are now, conspiring to bring a monarchy to America and to overthrow the Constitution, a Constitution which Jefferson himself didn't even really support. Um, so during the same month that Gouverneur Morris is named as the ambassador to France in January of 1792, Madison and Jefferson react with horror, absolute horror, to Hamilton's report on manufacturers. Madison writes to a colleague, quote, "What do you think of the commentary on the terms general welfare?" which is the argument that Hamilton makes in the report on manufacturers. Madison says, "This broaches a new constitutional doctrine of vast consequence and demanding the serious attention of the public. I consider it myself as subverting the fundamental and characteristic principle of the government, as contrary to the true and fair, as well as the received construction, and as bidding defiance to the sense in which the Constitution is known to have been proposed, advocated, and adopted. If Congress can do whatever is in their discretion to promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions." The issue is made explicit here. You have to hand it to Madison. He understands the issue. That that Hamilton's argument in the report on manufacturers, in which he, bases that argument on the general welfare clause and on the preamble, that it is the role of government in a republic to create a better future for the citizens of the republic, to use its sovereign federal power to foster scientific progress, technology, scientific agriculture, infrastructure, and advancements in productivity and an uplifting of the population, to give the population more opportunity for advancement, more opportunity for scientific knowledge. That this is the very basis of the republic, which the republic has a responsibility to act on. And Madison says, no, the government has no such power. And then in February, the very next month, Jefferson wrote a memo, which he circulated widely throughout the Capitol, entitled "Notes on the Constitutionality of Bounties to Encourage Manufacturing," in which he makes the exact same argument as Madison. He states that import duties are the only legal and allowable means of promoting manufacturers, and that direct government support for manufacturing, science, technology, infrastructure, direct government support for this is unconstitutional. That's what what Jefferson says in his notes on the constitutionality of bounties. So this is really, at least initially, what the war is about. It's about the Hamiltonian economic revolution. And to repeat what I went through in some detail in a previous class 2 or 3 weeks ago, this is not Hamilton versus Jefferson. Because in this fight, Hamilton is a partner, an inseparable partner with Washington. This is Washington, who takes office in April of 1789, who has, as as the burden of war was on him during the Revolutionary War, as the responsibility of the nation was on his shoulders during the Revolutionary War, the responsibility of creating the Republic is on his shoulders after April of 1789. It is Washington's decision, Washington's actions, which will determine whether the Republic is sustained or whether it is destroyed, killed in its cradle. And in that fight to create the Republic, Washington and Hamilton are partners. And Jefferson and Madison, they're not just criticizing Jefferson and Madison, they're not just criticizing Hamilton's policies. They are out to destroy the actions that Washington is taking with Hamilton to create the Republic. So this all escalates through 1792. Jefferson sends letters to Washington. In one of the letters he tells Washington that Hamilton is Hamilton's intention. He actually says this in a letter to Washington. Hamilton's intention is to prepare the way for a change from the present Republican form of government to a monarchy. That's what Jefferson says to Washington. And then in another letter, he says to Washington that, quote, Hamilton is a man whose history, from the moment in which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations, forgive me, against the liberty of the country. So, this is what's going on. In July, Washington summoned Jefferson to a private meeting in the White House, in which he dressed Jefferson down. Washington attacked Freneau's Gazette and all of the stuff that was coming out. And he's saying that, these actions and these articles are going to produce anarchy and a separation of the Union and the most dreadful calamities. Those are the terms he used. And essentially he ordered Jefferson to stop it. Now in France, I'm going to interpose, as I've been doing, a couple of events in France, so you get a sense of what's going on in France simultaneous with what's going on in America. During all of what I just went through with you in June and July, on June 20th, Louis XI and his family attempted to flee Paris. Louis XVI and his family attempted to flee Paris, but they were caught and they were brought back to Paris. Then on August 10th, you have the attack on the Tuileries Palace, which is where the monarchy was living, where all of the King's Guard was massacred. The monarchy was abolished by the act of the National Assembly, and an arrest warrant was issued for Lafayette. So this is the downfall of Lafayette. And then 3 weeks later, in Paris, you have what's called the September massacres, where partisans of the Jacobin Club and what have you, the revolutionaries, went from jail to jail and prison to prison in Paris and massacred the prisoners. There were at least 1,500 to 2,000 people who were massacred. They weren't taken out to be executed. They were just killed in their cells. And this included a lot of aristocrats and priests, but it also just included a lot of prisoners. They just killed everyone they found in these prison cells. That was the September massacre. Now, at that time, Gouverneur Morris wrote a letter to Jefferson, because technically, Morris is the ambassador to France, and the ambassadors come under the State Department. So technically, Jefferson is Morris's boss. But anyway, on mid-September, Gouverneur Morris writes a letter to Jefferson describing what is going on with these massacres. And Morris writes, "We have had 1 week of unchecked murders in which some thousands have perished. It began with between 200 and 300 of the clergy who were shot because they would not take the oaths prescribed by law. Thence the executors went from place to place where persons were confined. These were dispatched also, and afterwards they visited other prisons. All those who were confined, either on the accusation or suspicion of crimes, were killed." After receiving this letter, hearing of what was going on in Paris, Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend of his named William Short, who was the ambassador to the Netherlands. And this is after getting Morris's firsthand account of what went on. Jefferson writes to William Short, and he says, "The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest. And was ever such a prize won with so little innocent blood? My own affections have been wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but one Adam and one Eve left in every country, but left free, it would be better than it now is." So he doesn't even shed crocodile tears, the butchery, the mass executions are the price of revolution. And Jefferson says, I would rather see this than that the revolution fail. That's Thomas Jefferson. So in January of 1793, Louis XVI is beheaded. A month later, a resolution in Congress is put forward to adjourn Congress for the day to honor Washington's birthday, pay homage to Washington. And this is violently opposed by Madison, who declare that, honoring Washington by, recessing Congress for one day is a sign of monarchism. And it is like honoring Louis XVI, who was just beheaded. So he's likening Louis XVI to Washington. 5 days after Madison tried to stop this honoring of Washington, 5 days later, on February 27th, a resolution is introduced into Congress calling for the immediate dismissal of Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. The resolution was personally written by Jefferson. It was introduced by a man named Representative Giles, who was a member of the Virginia delegation, and it charged Hamilton with misuse of funds, with corruption, with maladministration, and said that he should be immediately removed from office. The resolution only received 5 votes, but one of the people who voted for it was Madison. Then on April 8th, Edmund Charles Genet arrives in the United States as the ambassador from France. This is Citizen Genet, you may have heard of. He doesn't sail into Philadelphia or New York. He sails to South Carolina, which is totally under the control of Jefferson's allies. In South Carolina, he spends a long time in South Carolina. He begins to recruit and arm American privateers to wage naval warfare against Britain from American ports. He begins to recruit a militia and to arm a militia, an American militia, which he wants to deploy to invade Florida. He's building up a military force in South Carolina. He then, after some time, begins to proceed to Philadelphia, partially by sea, partially by land. Everywhere he stops, Jefferson's people organize dinners, extravaganzas, mass rallies, cheering him on. And he proceeds to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, he asks for a meeting with Washington, which Washington grants him because he is the French ambassador, and he presents a formal proposal for America to join with France and to declare war on Great Britain. Washington says no and makes it very clear to him that this is never going to happen. From there, Genet stays in Philadelphia and begins to organize a mass movement. Now, at a certain point, not immediately, but weeks later, he actually issues a written appeal, as he gets more and more blocked by the Washington administration. He issues a written appeal calling upon the American people to rise up and overthrow the Washington administration, right? Again, keep in mind, Washington's been in office 2 years. The Republic is 2 years old. And Genet is calling for an overthrow of the Washington administration. Now, this was even too risky for Jefferson, and Jefferson had to back off from Genet at that point because he knew what would happen to him if he openly backed this call for revolution. And after this occurred, Washington, informed the French government that Genet was being expelled, that the French had to recall him as their ambassador. And while this is all going on, well, I'll say one more thing about Genet. While this is all going on in Philadelphia, there was one report later, this was a number of years later, where John Adams, who was in Philadelphia as the vice president, recounts what was going on in Philadelphia. And he writes to a friend in a letter. I don't know what year this is, but it's sometime later. And he says, "You certainly never felt the terrorism excited by Genet in 1793, when 10,000 people came out into the streets of Philadelphia day after day, threatening to drag Washington out of his house, threatening to effect a revolution in government, and compelling the country to declare war against England. The coolest minds and the coolest and firmest minds have given their opinion to me that nothing but the yellow fever saved the United States from a total revolution of government at that time, because a yellow fever swept Philadelphia at that time, killing a number of people, including key supporters of Genet." So then what happened is Washington in April 22nd issues his proclamation of neutrality. And again, this lands like a bombshell. And it's just, everything escalates, the intensity of the fight. Hamilton comes out and writes an essay entitled "Assertion of the Presidential Authority to Issue a Proclamation of Neutrality." Jefferson denounces this essay as a heresy, and he calls on Madison to respond. And then you get these exchange of essays, debates between Madison and Hamilton. It's called the Helvetius Pacificus debates. And Madison says that the Declaration, I'm not going to go into it, but he says that the Proclamation of Neutrality is unconstitutional. that Washington has no constitutional authority to issue it. Again, this gets back to this question of enumerated powers. Because what Madison says, he says, show me, where in the Constitution does it say that a president of the United States can issue a proclamation of neutrality? It's unconstitutional. It's unlawful. And this just escalates wildly all across the country. Now, look, I want to say something here. Normally I try to cut off by 5 or 5:15, but I really want to get through this, and it may take me another 20, 30 minutes. So unless someone starts screaming, that's what I'm going to do, because I want to get through this whole story. So now, look, one of the things that Genet does while he's in Philadelphia is he sets up something called the Democratic Society of Philadelphia. Now, this is modeled explicitly, on the Jacobin clubs in France, the revolutionary societies in France. And he sets the first one up in Philadelphia. The initial membership are all close allies of Jefferson. And some people that may surprise you, actually. Very soon, within a matter of weeks or a couple of months, duplicate democratic societies begin to appear all over the country, in many, many cities. New York, Charleston, South Carolina, all over the place, Baltimore, everywhere. This begins a massive grassroots campaign against the Washington administration. Now look, well, no, I had another thing I was going to read you here from Jefferson endorsing the bloodshed in France, but I think I'll leave that out. I will tell you, Tench Cox, who's in France, I won't read you the quote. He writes this letter to Jefferson, in which he's reporting about, all these people being executed and everything. And Jefferson writes him back, "Your letter gives me a comfortable view of French affairs." Isn't that quite a comfortable view of French affairs? So, in the summer of 1792 still? Yeah. No, in the summer of 1793, the New York Democratic Society issued a proclamation in which they say, "We take pleasure in avowing that we are lovers of the French nation, that we esteem their cause as our own. We most firmly believe that he who is an enemy to the French Revolution cannot be a firm Republican, and therefore ought not to be entrusted with the guidance of any part of the machine of government." Now, a couple weeks after that appeared, James Monroe wrote an article in the Virginia Gazette denouncing Hamilton, John Jay, and Rufus King by name. And in that article, James Monroe wrote, quote, "The game which the enemies of the French Revolution, who are likewise notoriously the partisans for monarchy, are now playing, is entitled to particular attention. A powerful faction is opposed to the great principles of the French Revolution, and much more attached to the Constitution of England than to that of our own country." And then about the same time he wrote that article, Monroe wrote a letter to John Breckinridge in which he says, "The monarchy party has seized a new ground wherein to advance their fortunes." So that's in the autumn of 1793. Then in October, Marie Antoinette is executed, guillotined, And then on October 31st, the Girondin deputies, more than 100 of them, who were all members of the National Assembly, but all of the Girondin representatives are arrested and guillotined. The Girondin party was, up to that time, the leading revolutionary party in France. That's the party that Tom Paine was a member of. And in fact, it was people think it was, Robespierre who executed Louis XVI. It was not. The Girondins were the ones who executed Louis XVI, and in fact executed Marie Antoinette. But on October 31st, they were all rounded up and they were all condemned to death and they were all murdered. And at that point, the party of Robespierre, what's called the Mountain, really takes full control over Paris. And what you get, I mean, the reign of terror did not start with Robespierre, but what you get, after the execution of the Girondins, and then as you move into 1794, I mean, the reign of terror reaches its peak. I mean, just, every day people are being let out in huge numbers to the guillotine and being killed in many other ways, shot, hanged, etc. Danton is murdered or is executed. His ally Desmoulins is executed. Condorcet, the Enlightenment figure, is arrested and found dead in his cell 2 days later from unexplained causes. A revolutionary court is established and people are just dispatched like this. And meanwhile, while this is all going on, you have James Monroe saying, those who are not with the French Revolution are the enemies of the American Republic, the enemies of the Constitution. While this is going on in Paris, you have Jefferson writing to Tench Coxe, your reports from Paris, give me comfort, while this stuff is going on. And they all knew, so anyway, so what occurs in 1794 is that you have an armed insurrection, armed rebellion against the government. Now, this goes down in history as the Whiskey Rebellion, and people sort of treat it kind of, I don't know, quaintly or humorously. Oh, you had these guys back in the backwoods with their stills, their little brown jugs, and they didn't want to pay no whiskey tax, and they treat it like it's some kind of folklore or something. This was an armed rebellion. It had been fomenting for 2 to 3 years. It had gotten more and more militant. It was completely backed. I mean, I don't know who said what to whom, but it received the complete support, at the very least, if it was not created by the democratic societies, Jefferson's and Genet's democratic societies. And what you got by the fall of 1794 was there was a rebel army which had gathered in Western Pennsylvania. And it was an army. There were 15,000 men, 15,000, which I should remind you was larger than Washington's army during the Revolutionary War. Right? They were armed, at their headquarters outside of Philadelphia, outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They set up mock guillotines. I don't think they were actual guillotines, but mock guillotines, and they put caricatures of Washington and other people on these guillotines. They threatened to march on Philadelphia, which was the national capital. At that time, it had moved from New York to Philadelphia. So what Washington did was he declared a national military mobilization. And he called out he federalized the state militias, and he called out the militiamen from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, and they and organized them into troops, and they marched into Pennsylvania. They marched out west. They marched into western Pennsylvania. They were already there. They marched into western Pennsylvania. They fought, and Washington was at the head of the army, riding his horse at the head of the army. The only president in American history to lead a military force into battle as commander in chief, while he's sitting in the presidency. They fought a couple of skirmishes, which, Washington's army won fairly easily, at which point Washington announced that he was returning to the capital, and he was leaving the army in the command of Henry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee. So Lee finished the rest of the campaign. Hamilton stayed with the army as Washington's personal representative, but Lee was in command. And, they finished off the rebellion fairly quickly. I mean, most of these guys confronted with the army surrendered fairly quickly. And as far as I know, they were all, even the ringleaders. I mean, I don't know, maybe there was one or two of them who were executed, but all of the people who were leading it were pardoned eventually. But they put this rebellion down. And 2 months later, Washington gave a speech to the opening of the Congress, to the Senate and the House of Representatives. And in that speech, he placed the blame for the armed rebellion squarely on the shoulders of the democratic societies. And I'll read you a quote from that speech. He said, to every description indeed of citizens, let praise be given, but let them preserve in their affectionate vigilance over that precious depository of American happiness to the Constitution of the United States. Let them cherish it for the sake of those who from every clime are daily seeking a dwelling place in our land. And when in the calm moments of reflection, they shall have retraced the origin and progress of the insurrection, let them determine whether it has not been fomented by combinations of men who, careless of consequences and disregarding the unerring truth that those who rouse cannot always appease a civil convulsion, have disseminated from ignorance or perversion of facts, suspicions, jealousies, and accusations of the whole government. Now, the only other major thing to cover here, is that's how 1794 ends, with the defeat of the armed rebellion in Pennsylvania. But then, it even escalates in 1795. It doesn't die there. In 1794, Washington had sent John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty with the British over a number of things, trade and tariffs and what have you. But the primary thing was to resolve issues left over from the Revolutionary War, like the British occupation of forts inside the borders of the United States along the Great Lakes. So he sends Jay over there to negotiate a treaty, and Jay's there for months. And finally, at the end of 1794, he signs a treaty with the British representatives, and the treaty is sent back to the United States. And it, as soon as it becomes public, again, there is an absolute uproar against Jay, against Washington. And here, you see, you know, the personal attacks on Washington escalate dramatically. The I mean, Jefferson personally, Jefferson had left the government. Jefferson left the government after the Washington's Declaration of Neutrality. Um, he violently opposed it. He tried to have it overturned. He was in the middle of organizing the democratic societies and everything they were doing in fomenting rebellion in the country. And after Washington's Declaration of Neutrality, Jefferson resigned from the government. So he's no longer in the government. And he attacked the Jay Treaty. He vilified it. He called it treason. And he tried to get it defeated in Congress. And the fight over the Jay Treaty was more intense, more violent, more convulsive than anything that had preceded it. Anything. The Declaration of Neutrality, the fight to defeat Hamilton's economic program. This was, an absolutely extreme battle that took place. The democratic societies organized rallies and marches and demonstrations all across the country. Jay was burned in effigy. Washington was burned in effigy. There was a mass riot outside of Washington's home in Philadelphia, in which people were screaming out, "Death to Washington! Death to Washington!" The Aurora, published an editorial calling for Washington's impeachment. The editorial said, "If ever a nation was debauched by a man, the American nation has been debauched by Washington. If ever a nation was deceived by man, the American nation was deceived by Washington. Let the history of the federal government instruct mankind that the mask of patriotism may be worn to conceal the foulest designs against the liberties of a people." So that was the Aurora, which Jefferson set up. And then from Paris, Tom Paine, for all of you Tom Paine fans out there, Tom Paine, hearing of the Jay Treaty, wrote an open letter to George Washington, which was published in the United States in all the Jeffersonian newspapers. And in that open letter, Tom Paine prayed. He said, I'm issuing a prayer for the imminent death of George Washington, praying for Washington's death. And he called Washington, quote, "treacherous in friendship and a hypocrite in public life." And he declared, quote, "The world will be troubled to decide whether you have abandoned your principles or whether you ever had any." That's Tom Paine. This is what was going on. Jefferson said that what Washington and Jay were proposing was a treaty between England and the Anglo-men of this country against the legislature and people of the United States. There were marches in these cities with people, Jeffersonian supporters, waving the French flag, the tricolor, singing La Marseillaise, dressed up as sans-culottes. Calling for the overthrow of the Washington administration. The New York Democratic Society issued a proclamation saying, "We take pleasure in avowing that we are lovers of the French nation, that we esteem their cause to be our own. We must most firmly believe that he who is the enemy to the French Revolution cannot be a firm Republican and ought not to be instructed with the guidance of any part of our government. And I'll read you two fairly incredible quotes, both from the South. A Jeffersonian newspaper in Virginia wrote an editorial which said, quote, "Notice is hereby given that in case the treaty entered into by that damned arch traitor John Jay with the British tyrant should be ratified, a petition will be presented to the next General Assembly of Virginia at their next session, praying that the said state may secede from the Union and be under the government of 100,000 free and independent Virginians." So that's from Virginia. And then in South Carolina, the Democratic Republican Society of Charleston issued a manifesto in which they said, quote, "Resolved, that we pledge ourselves to our brethren of the Republican societies throughout the Union, as far as the ability and individual influence of a numerous society can be made to extend, that we will promote every constitutional mode to bring John Jay to trial and to justice. He shall not escape, if guilty, that punishment which will at once wipe off the stain laid upon us, and be a warning to traitors hereafter, how they sport with the interests and feelings of their fellow citizens." He was instructed or he was not. If he was, we will drop the curtain. If not, and he acted of and from himself, we shall only lament the want of a guillotine. So you get a sense of the temper of the times. And Washington, Hamilton then took the lead in fighting against this, to protect Washington, to defend Washington, and to defend the republic that he and Washington had worked to create. What he did is he wrote 38 articles. Well, he published. He actually wrote 28 of them. He authored and published 38 articles within a period of a little over 2 months. So that's like basically an article every other day. And these were published in pro-Washington newspapers and other newspapers all across the United States. He called it The Defense. That was the title for this. There were 38 articles. Hamilton wrote 28 of them, and Rufus King, the unsung hero, Rufus King wrote 10 of the articles. 38 articles, and they were published all over the United States, in which Hamilton defends the treaty, goes through it point by point, what Jay had accomplished, rips into the arguments being put forward by Jefferson and Madison and others, et cetera, et cetera. And a funny thing happened. After the earlier, Hamilton, Jefferson, in one of the earlier fights I went through, Jefferson had convinced Madison to respond to some of Hamilton's writings. This was what I call the Pacificus Helvetius debates, right, where Madison and Jefferson debated in the press. Well, that was earlier. When Hamilton and Rufus King began publishing these defenses of the Jay Treaty, Jefferson is beside himself, and he writes a letter to Madison, pleading with him to respond. And this is where one of these famous quotes from Jefferson comes from, where he says, we can't just let him speak out. He will basically, he'll wipe the floor with us if we don't do anything. And this is where Jefferson says to Madison that Hamilton is really a colossus to the anti-Republican Party. Without numbers, he is a host within himself. They're terrified of Hamilton. So he pleads with Madison to once again come forward and to answer to Hamilton. And this time, Madison won't do it. He refuses. So they do get some other people to do it, to attack Hamilton. Including Robert Livingston in New York, and then also Alexander Dallas in Philadelphia. And I think I will mention it here because I said people involved in the democratic societies might surprise you. Alexander Dallas is one of them. But when Dallas and others are publishing their attacks on Hamilton and Washington, many of these attacks are published by Matthew Carey. For those who have a warm spot for Matthew Carey, he did not desert to Jefferson later. While Jefferson and Madison are engaged in a conspiracy to destroy the republic that Hamilton and Washington are creating, and launching these vicious attacks on Washington. In fact, one of the attacks was one of the final attacks was in Box Aurora, where he printed forged documents purporting to show that Washington had accepted bribes from the British during the Revolutionary War, so that all along he had been a British spy and should suffer the same, fate as Benedict Arnold. That was actually printed in the Aurora during the midst of all this. And, while that's all going on, Matthew Carey is lined up with the Aurora and with Jefferson. But that's neither here nor there. So look, I don't want to leave this on a negative note. The next week is Washington's Republic. And, we're going to cover Washington's Republic. And we will not leave it on a negative note, but the purpose, I got to the end of 1795, and this then takes us into 1796, and I'm not going to pick up the chronology next week, but I am going to deal with the closing moments of the Washington administration, and what was accomplished. But I wanted to give you a sense of the insurrection. Look, we had had a government during the Revolutionary War which didn't function. The only reason why we did not collapse during the Revolutionary War was because of Washington's control of the army. It was Washington's army that kept the nation together during the Revolutionary War, not the Continental Congress. And then the Articles of Confederation was a catastrophe. The question was, what, in 1789, could this new republic be brought into existence? Could it be sustained? Could it fulfill the, charge that it was given at the Constitutional Convention? Could it become a republic which would become the beacon of hope and the temple of liberty for mankind for generations to come? And what you had was Jefferson, and with his, his pets, Madison and others, who came in from the very first day to prevent this from happening. And you read what these guys wrote. eternal loyalty to the French Revolution, eternal loyalty to the French Revolution. What the hell are they talking about? The French Revolution was founded on principles hostile to the principles of the American Revolution, as I went through, hopefully, conclusively last week. But this is what they're saying they want. So I went long. That's it, folks.